It has been a soggy September so far thanks to a persistent weather pattern across the Northern Hemisphere. During the next few days, the weather patterns across the Northern Hemisphere will be shaken up. But how exactly that will end up affecting the UK's weather, well, that's where it gets very complicated. Perfect fodder, in other words, for this week's Met Office Deep Dive. Thank you for joining me for this in-depth weather discussion that we do every Tuesday. You can, of course, catch these on our YouTube channel, on our Spotify channel. We post them on our WhatsApp channel as well. If you want to watch more of these and if you enjoy them, click like, comment, subscribe, tell your friends all about them. Now, before we get into how the weather patterns are changing during the next few days, let's take a look back at September because it has been a very soggy month so far. The map on screen behind me shows the percentage of the whole of September's rainfall that we've seen so far this month. We're, of course, 15 days in at the time of recording, and you'd normally expect exactly 50% of rainfall, which would be this light brown colour, perhaps the mid-brown colour here. But, as you can see, there's not much brown on the map. Certainly some browns there across northern Scotland, parts of eastern England, but much of the map is white. There are some blue spots, and that indicates that parts of South Wales, southern England, the north and northwest of England, parts of Northern Ireland, where we've got those blue spots. Rainfall has actually been above average for September as a whole, just for the first half of the month. So I'm sure you're not surprised to hear it has, for many places, been a soggy month, but particularly towards the south and the west of the UK. However, we do have a significant deficit in rainfall to make up for, and we're not quite there yet. This shows the total cumulative rainfall so far this year compared with average. The black line running through the middle here is the average rainfall we see through the year, obviously getting higher and higher as each month passes. But this is the actual rainfall we've seen averaged across the UK, the black line underneath, and the brown colour indicates how big the deficit is, the average compared with what we've actually seen. And there has been some nibbling away of that deficit during the first half of September. You can see that's got a bit smaller after being particularly large at the end of August, but some way to go. However, that does vary region to region. And if you're thinking, well, my region hasn't seen a deficit of rainfall because it's been very rainy here, actually, all regions, I've taken a look at this earlier, we've got these graphs for all regions of the UK, all regions still running at a deficit so far this year. Even southwest England and South Wales, where it has been particularly wet, as I say, some parts seeing above average rainfall so far this September. You can see, just by the steepness of this line, that's the rainfall that we've seen in the last few weeks, we have seen about half or just over half of the deficit disappear thanks to the rainfall that we've seen during the last 2 or 3 weeks in southwest England and South Wales. But again, some way to go. We'd need another few weeks of similar rainfall to get back on track. That may or may not happen. More on that in a moment. But also, northern Scotland, very rainy part of the UK in general, but this year a significant deficit. Not seen as much rain by comparison to south and southwest of England during September, so that deficit has remained similar to how it was during the summer. However, if you're thinking, well, it's not been particularly dry in northern Scotland, well, northern Scotland on average gets much more rain than the south and southwest of England and South Wales and so on. So if you were to take the amount of rainfall that northern Scotland has seen so far this year, it's about 700 millimetres. And if I move on to the graph for the east and northeast of England, if we imagine that there was about 700 millimetres of rainfall up to this point in the year, we'd be up here. It would be close to record-breaking rainfall. So what has been a deficit in rain for northern Scotland, the amount of rain they've seen, if we saw that amount of rain in other parts of the UK, it would be a very wet year so far. It just shows the regional variation of rainfall. But while we're talking about deficits, the deficit in northeast England is really significant. It's this size of brown and very little nibbling away of that due to the recent rain in the last few weeks. So certainly some way to go for the east and northeast of England to make up for the shortfall of rainfall that we've seen this year so far. Why has it been so wet so far this year? Well, that's where I want to take an in-depth look at the bigger picture, and we're going to get a bit more complicated here, but hopefully it will come clearer later on. And let's take a look first of all at how the jet stream was shaped across the Northern Hemisphere on the 11th of September. So this is last Thursday at the time of recording. And what I want to do here is take a bit of a different look at the Northern Hemisphere. We've got the North Pole in the middle. We've got the UK here underneath an area of low pressure. North America there. We've got the Pacific Ocean here, Bering Strait there, Russia here. So we're looking down on the North Pole, and the orange colours around here, well, that's the, or it might be green, I don't know, that's the jet stream, okay? And what you'll notice immediately is the jet stream's pretty flat and quite strong across the Atlantic. Now, when the jet stream is flat and strong across the Atlantic, you tend to get low after low after low effect in the UK, and that is indeed what we've seen through the first half of September. So the jet stream's been in this position across the Atlantic, and that acts as a conveyor belt. It picks up areas of low pressure, moves them across the Atlantic, deepens them, sends them to the UK, rinse and repeat. That's what we've seen. Now, what we've also seen is a similar setup across parts of the Pacific, another jet stream sending areas of low pressure into North America. In fact, I can draw on here and label where we've got the jet stream just dipping across these oceans and what we call troughs. These wide dips in the jet stream. Although it looks quite flat, there is actually quite a wide trough. I'll label it with a T there. So there's a trough there. There's another trough here. Label that one with a T. And there's another trough over, let's see, that goes like that. Probably over here somewhere. That's a T. Oops. In between, we've got some ridges where you get more settled weather. So there's a big ridge over North America. There's another big ridge coming out of here. And there's another ridge over here. Now, what you'll immediately notice is that we've got 3 ridge trough couplets. It's not perfect because there are things like topography that gets in the way, and I've not traced the outline of this jet stream here, which is the subtropical jet stream rather than the polar jet stream running close to the Himalayas. You can see there's a bit of a hint there of a jet stream to the north of Russia, and it gets complicated over Asia because of the topography and so on. The jet stream tends to split. So I'm kind of tracing the polar jet stream. Likewise, over North America, there's another branch, the subtropical jet stream running through there, but actually there's a ridge in the more general jet stream over North America. So there are these ridge trough couplets, and there are 3 of them. 1, 2, 3. It's what we call a wave number 3 pattern, and it is fairly common in the autumn, in the winter, and it happens when you get these temperature contrasts from the North Pole to the subtropics. You get that temperature contrast, and I went into this in a previous deep dive talking about the difference in the pressure way up high at jet stream level as a result of those temperature contrasts, and that's what helps fuel the jet stream. If there was no land masses, no topography, no mountains, you'd get a fairly straight circle around here. Straight circle, is that an oxymoron? Straight line, or a perfect circle, without these wriggles, if there was no topography. But the topography, and I did a video on that, by the way, what if the world had no mountains, how the weather would be shaped by that scenario. And that's on our Learn About Weather channel if you're keen to watch that, explore some of these ideas. But basically, we do have mountains. Most notably, we've got the Himalayas, we've got the Rockies. They tend to cause the jet stream to wobble, and so that induces these waves in the jet stream. And of course, there are other reasons why we get waves in the jet stream. There's a whole topic I could cover on Rossby waves, but that's for another day. For simplicity's sake, let's say in a typical autumn-winter setup, we've got this temperature contrast that causes the jet stream to circle around the globe. And we've got these waves, 3 waves, wave number 3 pattern. And when it's like this, it tends to be quite stationary. When I say stationary, I mean these troughs and ridges remain roughly where they are, because the fewer ripples across the northern hemisphere there are, the slower moving these ridges and troughs are, and sometimes they can just become stuck. So you can typically get one trough here in the Pacific, one trough in the Atlantic, just sending us low, 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 low. A fairly default setup for the UK in the autumn and winter. But sometimes there can be a smaller disturbance in the flow. Let's say, for example, a system developed, a low pressure system developed and became a fierce but relatively small storm. That can help force another ripple into this pattern. And if you force another one so that there's a wave number 4 pattern, well, then things start moving a bit more freely across the globe. And this is what we're expecting to see over the next few days. Now, that was Thursday the 11th of September. This is Thursday the 18th of September. And just want to point out a few things here. The first thing you might notice is that there are smaller ripples. Rather than these wide troughs and ridges, there are more troughs and ridges, but they are bunched up in a smaller domain across the Atlantic and North America. So if we just draw, there's one trough, here's another trough, this one's kind of related to that one, and there's another trough over here which kind of goes up like that, 1, 2, 3, and then there's another one, let's see, that comes down like that, for example. And then it does get a bit messy over here, so it's not going to be perfect. There's the ridges, there's certainly a ridge over here. There's a very sharp ridge here and a ridge here. So now, although it looks a little bit messier, what we can see is there's trough ridge there over North America, another trough ridge coming out of America into the Atlantic and the UK, another trough ridge here, and a trough ridge here. There's 4. It's a wave number 4 pattern. What that ultimately means is that these start progressing around the globe a bit more. And that means that this trough over here will move into the UK. That ridge will move over here. Eventually we'll get that ridge coming into the Atlantic. So the whole trough ridge system starts moving around the globe rather than becoming stuck. So remember, the first half of September we had this wide trough in the Atlantic sending us low, 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 low for 2 weeks. Now, over the next few days, there's another wave number added into the mix, which forces the whole system to start rotating, which means that we start to see a bit more change in terms of we'll get a trough for a few days and then we get a ridge for a few days. But at the same time, these individual lows become slower moving because they start moving like a meandering river. They've got a greater path to go around. So individual lows caught up in this rather than moving across the Atlantic nice and fast along a straight line like a motorway, boom, low, 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 low. These are meandering slowly along country roads, so any low that does turn up will be slower moving in the vicinity of the UK. Equally, any high that turns up in the vicinity of the UK, slower moving. This is this Thursday. If we just fast forward once again to the following Thursday, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Again, let's label the troughs. There's quite a nice one coming out of here. And there's another trough over here, a ridge in between, like that. Another trough here. And there's certainly a trough there and a ridge in between. And then for the UK, there's a big ridge over here. This trough here. Have I added them up correctly? 1, 2, 3. There's probably a ridge here somewhere. Oh, wrong colour. Anyway, you get the point. There's basically wave number 4 pattern sticks But for the UK, this is Thursday the 25th of September. This is the last few days of the month. There's a big ridge over the UK. However, there's just one fly in the ointment here, and that is there's another branch of the jet stream down here, and there's actually a low pressure over the continent which has become cut off from the main flow. I'm going to be talking a bit more about that later. So yes, we transition to a period in which we get this slow-moving trough over the UK through the rest of this week and into the weekend. Then we change to a setup through next week where we've got this slow-moving ridge over the UK. So yeah, we're getting this progression rather than a persistent trough over the Atlantic sending us low, 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 low. We get this persistent trough crossing the UK slowly, bringing some very unsettled weather through the rest of the week and into the weekend, early next week, before a ridge sets up for some time through the second half of next week. This is what this is showing, but with the caveat that the low pressure from the original trough gets cut off and starts, well, just wandering about aimlessly over the continent and could still bring us some rain. I did say it was complicated at the beginning, didn't I? Hopefully that's made sense though. Hopefully that's helped to explain how the weather patterns are changing during the next few days and why the second half of September is going to look quite different, but not necessarily completely dry for everyone. Let's take a look at the details then. And going back to the time being, we've still got this fairly wide trough over the Atlantic. It's still able to send us areas of low pressure, and after a fine day for many of us on Tuesday, still some showers out there, but fine for many of us, the next low comes along. So we're still, at the time recording, right now, next couple of days, we're still in this pattern where we've got this broad Atlantic trough sending us areas of low pressure. Here's the next low. It comes in overnight, areas of rain, strong winds, etc., etc. That then moves through, but relatively slowly, and it starts to slow down as we see the jet stream in the Atlantic dig down. And what happens then? The low pressure that we see arrive overnight, it doesn't zip through like previous lows. It just slowly moves away to the north and leaves behind this trailing weather front. And that is causing us a few headaches going into the weekend, because that's going to mark the difference between some very warm air to the south and some cooler, more showery weather to the north, but also it's going to result in a zone of rain, the location of which is uncertain, because as the weather pattern becomes more amplified, as that trough in the Atlantic digs down and we get this ridge building up to the north and east of the UK, going into the weekend, the whole pattern slows down, and some computer models have this weather front just a bit further north, some have it just a bit further south, and that's crucial because it's going to contain within it a zone of heavy rain. And the question marks over where it ends up will be of significance to the weather during Friday, Saturday, and into Sunday, in fact, into next week. Why are those question marks there? Well, I hinted at it earlier when I said that during the next few days, there's going to be another trough ridge coupler added to the wave number 3 pattern. And the reason for that is due to what's going on, here we go, on the other side of North America, in fact, on the eastern side of the Pacific at the time of recording. Now, having traced back the origins of the more amplified jet stream going into the weekend, it looks like it's coming from the Pacific, and in fact, it's due to this area of low pressure here, which deepens quite significantly. Well, really, right now it's deepening quite significantly. And what that does is, and here's the jet stream. This is the same jet stream that we show with this point of view, but it's just adding a bit more detail here. So this is North America. And what that low pressure that I mentioned does is it just pulls the jet stream south and forces it so far south that it's like adding another trough ridge couplet into the system. It's like cracking a whip. It forces another ripple in, which then propagates downstream. So here's that ripple. It starts off during Tuesday, just to the west of North America, and then we can trace it. It pushes south and it allows the jet stream over Canada to move north. Watch this. Here's North America. We're looking at this branch of the jet stream now and how it goes really quite far north then. And I think I drew this very narrow ridge on one of the charts earlier, or for Thursday the 18th of September. Here it goes quite far north into the Arctic, and then that causes, by Friday, it to dig down across the eastern seaboard. What does that do? It propagates again into the Atlantic. We get this big ridge to the west of the UK, and the trough that's been over the Atlantic all this time gets squeezed. There's the squeezing of the trough, and it gets squeezed so much that a portion of it gets cut off. It's what we call a cut-off upper low. And they are a real nuisance when it comes to forecasting, because the exact location of this cut-off low will be crucial for determining the weather through the weekend and into next week. Why are they a nuisance? Well, it's easy enough to predict the movement of low pressure when it's being carried by a relatively flat jet stream. Jet stream's pointing this way, the low pressure will move along like that. When you get this cut-off low situation, it becomes detached from the main flow of the jet stream. And they can wander around aimlessly. And this is the situation we find ourselves in into next week. Eventually, here's the ridge ends up over the UK. So if it wasn't for the cut-off low, we'd have a long period of very settled weather across the whole of UK. But whilst that will happen in places, we do have this cut-off upper low, which is going to wander aimlessly over Europe. And that's what causes the uncertainty going into next week and also through the weekend. So that's important for several reasons. First of all, the rainfall. Now, there's going to be further spells of wet weather over the next few days. Initially, it's the standard area of low pressure moving in from the west, bringing wet weather through tonight and into the start of tomorrow. And it's parts of Wales that are likely to see the heaviest rainfall. This shows the 6-hour rainfall accumulations. And it's overnight where we're likely to see, and into tomorrow, where we're likely to see the heaviest of the rain across parts of Wales. You can see the higher parts of Wales being picked out by this rainfall fairly widely, 15 to 25 millimetres, and in some spots over South Wales and North Wales, 50 millimetres or more in a space of 6 hours. So that could cause some issues. That's why there are Met Office weather warnings in force. Let's take a quick look at those. We'll rewind a little bit there. So these are the warnings for parts of Wales. It's been a wet month so far, obviously, in these regions. More rain overnight and into Wednesday could cause issues. So that's the first spell of rain. But then we also have this trailing weather front to think about. Here's Wednesday afternoon. After the wet start, many parts of the UK dry up. The trailing weather front, though, comes along, and it's really sticking around. You can see it there still on Thursday across parts of northern England, North Wales, southern Scotland. Either side of that, bright weather and increasingly warm in the south and southeast. Similarly, Friday, we've got the trailing weather front. It's still with us. Low pressure pulls away, but with the jet stream becoming increasingly aligned with that weather front, it's just going to wriggle and oscillate fairly erratically across the UK. And in fact, Friday, 2 o'clock, I wouldn't take this too literally, because there are other computer models have the rain much further north than this is showing. So it is likely to be further north into North Wales, northern England, southern Scotland, and so on. Either way, we've got this zone of rain to think about, and it turns increasingly heavy into the weekend as the cut-off upper low, here it is, starts to turn up across the UK. So we've got this upper trough coming along. That's likely to cause the air to rise. It's likely to cause that rainfall to become heavier. At the same time, start to draw up, in particular on Friday, because rather than west to southwesterly winds, we start to draw up more warmth across the south and southeast. Higher temperatures. There's a possibility of 25 to 27 Celsius in East Anglia and the southeast, depending on how much cloud we see. there. So it's warm and bright in the southeast. It's cool and showery in the far north. In between, we've got this zone of wet weather. Like I say, some uncertainty about exactly where it ends up on Friday and into Saturday, but it is likely to be a bit further north than the graphics are showing here. Eventually, that low ends up stuck over the UK during the weekend. Again, some uncertainty about the exact position of the low because at this stage it's really slow moving. It's a very elongated jet stream. You can see this is the bit where it starts to detach from the main flow. You can see high pressure coming in there into the north on Sunday. So Scotland, Northern Ireland likely to have a fine day. 1 or 2 showers, plenty of fine sunny weather. England and Wales cloudier. The risk of some heavy thundery rain as that low slowly starts to meander away. Much cooler, obviously, because of that. We start to see this northeasterly wind returning. So big swings in temperature as we go through the next few days. Very warm in the southeast on Friday, more like average elsewhere, and then much cooler later in the weekend and early next week as northeasterly winds move in as this high builds in. So what I was talking about at the start, where we've got this large trough, and we've had it for the last 2 weeks in the North Atlantic. We've had low pressure, followed by low pressure, followed by low pressure. That's all changing. What we know is that jet stream is becoming more amplified, more wriggly across the Northern Hemisphere. And what that results in is this slow-moving trough over the UK through Friday and into the weekend, with some heavy rain in places, particularly towards central parts at first and then towards the south and southeast later. Then eventually we get this big ridge developing, this high pressure muscling in as the ridge in the west moves into the UK. But this is the uncertainty as we go into next week. It's this cut-off low. Whilst the rest of the UK sees higher pressure and a big ridge pushing all the way up to the north, this cut-off low could stick close to the south and southeast. Initially, what that means is it's likely to bring some heavy rain early next week into southern counties of England, perhaps South Wales. But increasingly through next week, it looks like that low will move into the continent and bring further showery weather to the southeast, whilst the rest of the UK turns drier, albeit with a relatively chilly northeasterly wind for a few days. So yes, things are changing significantly. No, it won't make things immediately drier, but eventually, later next week, it does look likely that much of the UK, even if not all of the UK, so the southeast excluded potentially, will be more settled for a few days as this large ridge very slowly progresses across the country. Late in September, that ridge is likely to establish itself over Scandinavia, with another very slow-moving trough coming along to the west, with low pressure slowly approaching from the west. But these are slow-moving systems, so the big difference between the second half of September and the first half is the progression in the Atlantic. These lows no longer zipping through, so when they do arrive, likely to last for a few days, but equally, when we get higher pressure, also likely to last for a few days. Very different weather patterns, not necessarily entirely dry, but a change on the horizon nevertheless. We'll keep updated on the day-to-day detail, as always, of course. Hope you enjoyed this one. Let us know in the comments if you've got any questions. We'll try and answer them on the Weather Studio Live on Friday, but otherwise, that's all from me. Bye-bye.